I first met Martin Luther, the film that is, about a half-century ago, and I'm here to tell you the story of how this film seemed to have a life of its own. It's a special case. The film became a kind of classic in its time, the saga of a movement, the Protestant Reformation, that changed the world. And the film itself is a cinematic innovation. It was controversial, as Luther was. It dealt with taboos, as Luther did. And it changed hearts and minds throughout the world. But let's start at the beginning. While Martin Luther never intended his theological propositions and arguments to launch a new branch of the Christian church, Protestant churches did grow out of the 16th century movement begun in Germany. By the 20th century, there were some 80 million Lutherans within almost 400 million Protestants around the world. Before that time, the Roman Catholic Church and the Orthodox churches embraced nearly all of Christendom. But after World War II, church leaders, even within the Lutheran Church, who borrowed his name, discovered that many of their members really didn't know much about Martin Luther. Dr. Paul C. Empey championed the idea of a film biography of the Reformer. Empey was head of the National Lutheran Council, a group which included most of U.S. Lutherans. He had pioneered using films in reaching his church constituency. His communication officer, the Reverend Carl Lundquist, set about to test the interest among other groups. In the United States, he broached the idea to Dr. Oswald C.J. Hoffman of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. His group was very interested. He also checked abroad with Bishop Hans Lilja, hero of the German resistance against Hitler. The Germans and others within the newly constituted Lutheran World Federation were eager to see this new project materialize. Empey had been pleased with the talents of a scriptwriter, Alan Sloan, who had written a prize-winning movie for Lutherans on resettlement of refugees. He was engaged to do a first draft of the Martin Luther story. Then Empey convened an ad hoc group as the nucleus of a new inter-Lutheran film committee. Henry Endres, who had found film effective in his stewardship education within churches, was made the administrator of the effort. Hoffman's group also had film experience, and armed with Sloan's first draft, they conferred with producers in Hollywood and New York. Louis de Rochemont, fabled producer of The March of Time, Fighting Lady, and dramatic feature films, saw this as a major film possibility. De Rochemont picked the top producer of his staff, Lothar Wolff, to head the project. Wolff was also a veteran of The March of Time, among other films, and had produced films in Germany and Denmark before World War II, and headed the U.S. Coast Guard film unit after becoming a U.S. citizen. Wolff, Endres, and Sloan became a creative team to refine draft after draft of the script. Members of the Lutheran Church Productions Board and Luther experts among historians and theologians submitted their reactions. Church historians, Professors Yaroslav Pelikan, later of Yale, and Theodor Tappert of Philadelphia Lutheran Seminary were the key consultants for the script. Each had specialized in the life and works of Martin Luther. Sloan kept revising and improving the script and then worked with the Hollywood director Irving Pitchell, chosen to be the creative head of the project. This man was cast in London to play the title role of Luther, Niall McGuinness. He had impressive credits from cinema and stage in Britain. But what about the beard? Well, as it turned out, Luther had a beard at one point in his life, as the film will show. He was in hiding in the Wartburg Castle and took a disguise as Knight George. But at other points in his life, he was tonsured differently. But he also wore the hat of an academic theologian. But as a monk, the actor portrayed Luther like this. Mr. de Rochemont commissioned a painting of Luther as portrayed in the film by actor McGuinness. It was on display at the New York opening of the film. This pose, used in much of the publicity and advertising, was the basis for the painting. It came from one of the movie's most climactic scenes.
I cannot and I will not recant. Here I stand. I can do no other. God help me.
De Rochemont meets with the local crew on the set in Wiesbaden, Germany. Much of the film was shot here. But American director Irving Pitchell, shown here in costume, he had a role in the film himself, wanted also to use as many authentic settings as possible, and so their scouts looked for locations that the Second World War had not damaged. The same castle at Wartburg that Luther made famous, as well as other authentic sites. The German set designers and craftsmen were able to replicate famous places, like this mural that decorated the scenes of the Vatican chambers in Rome. Models were built of the authentic architecture of the 16th century. Here we see the artists at work on the Wittenberg City Church, and here on the famous city church with its twin towers, and here a model of the Wittenberg skyline as Luther saw it and as you see it in the film. Cameraman Joseph Brunn on the set checks the light before a take. For his cinematography for Martin Luther, Brunn was nominated for an Academy Award. Another actor playing the role of Duke Frederick gets a trim from the makeup artist. British actor David Horn is royally dressed and ready for the major trial scene. The president of Louis de Rochemont Associates, Borden Mace, and Henry Endres, head of the Lutheran Film Group, came to Minneapolis. I was asked to organize a world premiere of Martin Luther in Minneapolis. Minneapolis, not Hollywood, not New York. I had never done anything like this before, but I had been active in films and broadcasting for one of the National Lutheran Church bodies. It helped that producer Lothar Wolf briefed me on the many facets of this amazing production. I met with the filmmakers and the sponsoring board and presented my plan. They gave me the green light, and so I went to work. Early in May 1953, the film opened for the first time in Minneapolis. We had rented the Lyceum Theater, and with special promotion in a 4-state area, we filled the theater for 6 weeks with daily crowds, many recruited through churches. We played on the challenge of what so many had said, that it couldn't be done, and the word-of-mouth publicity really made it a success. People were curious, and for good reason. Never before had a major media event exposed the reasons for the 16th century Reformation that changed the world forever. To encourage other supporters and theater chains around the country, we published the story of our Minneapolis experience. An ambitious advertising campaign was created. And then, in September 1953, it was time for the New York City opening at the Guild Theater at Rockefeller Center. Right in the heart of Times Square, Borden Mace and Henry Endres had a major billboard erected. This became a kind of signal to the commercial world that Martin Luther was an important film that the public would come to see. The rave review in the New York Times by Bosley Crowther set the tone for the critical acclaim that followed throughout the nation. And additional reviews in such trade publications as Variety helped to spark enthusiasm within the film industry. Busloads of supporters came from the faith communities in city after city. Across the border in Canada, however, the film met resistance. Not here at the Canadian premiere in Ontario, but in the province of Quebec. The Luther film was banned by the Quebec Board of Censors. Maclean's magazine quoted the chief censor as saying, "Whether or not it is historically accurate is not the point." Responding to protests, the head censor wrote to the sponsoring committee, "The attitude taken by the censors board was to avoid any religious strife amongst the people of our province. Laborde does not see that any further discussion of so delicate a theme would be in the general interest. But as this cover from the Canadian edition of Time shows, the film was later publicly exhibited in spite of the ban. Churches opened their doors and 11 interdenominational houses of worship became temporary theaters and were packed with an estimated 30,000 curious viewers. Ultimately, 9 years later, the ban was lifted officially in Quebec. But at the time, as producers of the film, we were concerned with the allegations that the film was inaccurate. Some opponents even accused us of being communists. We felt we had to set the record straight. I went directly to one of the top Luther scholars, Roland Bainton. Professor Bainton of Yale had authored the most popular biography of Luther, Here I Stand, still widely read today. He wrote for us a powerful pamphlet defending the accuracy of the movie, and it helped to still the storm. One of the biggest boosts to the popularity of the Luther film was its being nominated in 2 categories for the Academy Awards in 1954. For Joseph Brunn's cinematography among black and white films, and for Fritz Marschott and Paul Marwitz for art direction among black and white films. And indeed, this helped to usher in the world distribution of the Martin Luther movie, after it had first been acclaimed in the United States. After the Edinburgh Film Festival had honored the movie, some in the British public who had not yet seen it became impatient. Editorial writers asked, "Why may we not see this film?" When it did open, crowds came, and supporters brought busloads to fill theaters. Our German partners had their own language version, and the film swept over West Germany with enthusiastic response among critics and the public. It was never shown in the eastern part. 20th Century Fox signed on as a worldwide distributor for the movie. They placed it in theaters in many countries and had it translated into many languages. In India, the government required several very small cuts to remove scenes of iconoclasts smashing statues. In Indonesia, some patrons arrived in a horse-drawn conveyance. In Rotterdam, the Netherlands, we see crowds going in to see the Dutch premiere of Martin Luther. And in Amsterdam, there was still a lineup in the 4th week. Meanwhile, in the United States, the Martin Luther film had its second run, not as popular as the first, however. Would you believe that the film continued to be shown for a half-century after the highly successful theatrical release? The producers decided it was time to make it available for educational use in 16mm format for libraries, colleges, universities, and churches. Remember, this was in the age before video discs and video cassettes. Again, we mounted a major promotional campaign, and it resulted in a phenomenal record. Individual copies of the almost 2-hour movie were grabbed up by hundreds of individual churches of various denominations. The next headlines for the Martin Luther film came in 1956, when we had scheduled the television premiere of the film in Chicago. A contract had been signed with WGN-TV, the Chicago Tribune station. Suddenly it was canceled, apparently from pressure. Public protests, particularly from Protestant churches, came quickly. While WGN-TV never did show the film, another station in Chicago did sponsor the premiere of the film and was rewarded with some of the highest ratings of the season. Subsequently, the film was shown around the world by television stations. In 1983, on the occasion of the 500th Jubilee of Martin Luther's birth, a special television edition was prepared, and David Soul, the actor, introduced it.
There's a lot of fear in our world today, too. And I believe that Martin Luther's legacy translates into hope and courage and steadfastness for humanity. In the face of rebuke and rejection and condemnation by 16th century authorities, he took his stand on conscience. His story speaks to me, and I hope it will to you too. That's why I'm so pleased to invite you to watch this movie, full of lingering overtones for our own time. The celebrated film, Martin Luther.
And finally, a set of teaching films using sequences from the film was produced with 4 quarter hours packaged on one cassette.
Let's look briefly at the man Luther to see if we can learn what was driving him. We'll be helped by some memorable images from the movie Martin Luther and related productions from Lutheran Film Associates.
I hope some of this background material from our biography of a film will make watching the movie more interesting and meaningful for you. Thanks for watching. I'm Bob Lee.